we call ourselves the People's College Football Show. And you can't do that unless you involve the people into the show. We say that multiple times a week. Y'all are as much a part of this operation as we are over here in the control room behind the mic in front of the camera. And so every single live show, we go to the live chat and we ask y'all, hey, what do you think about X, Y, and Z thing? Hey, give us your takes. Give us your thoughts. It's funny. Didn't get to do that yesterday. We were pressed for time, but most every single live show we get to do that. And not every single, but the majority of live shows, we hear from y'all saying, hey, what happens if X team beats B team and we have one lost conference champion from this conference, but this conference champion has one loss, they beat this team. So bottom line, supply and demand, y'all want to talk about playoff scenarios is what I've gathered. So put out a tweet or an X post, whatever you want to call it, on my Twitter page at JD Pickell and ask y'all what are some of your hypothetical college football playoff scenarios on a Big Picture Wednesday. We're going to unpack a couple of them right now. First things first, make sure you're subscribed. College football every single day. We appreciate y'all being dialed in. Don't want you to miss a thing. Great way to stay engaged is one, subscribing, two, follow me on the Twitter and Instagram at JD Pickell. With that out of the way, the first scenario I want to unpack, this is an awesome handle. Yeah, you right, 84. I love that. I absolutely love that. His scenario is Washington is the only undefeated team after championship weekend. So we're assuming a couple of things here. We had to take some liberties to get a gauge for it. But he's saying, hey, Washington, they run the table. They likely play Oregon. They end up going undefeated. Magical run for the Huskies. So he has them beating Oregon State this weekend as well. They're in. What happens to the rest of the field if nobody else is undefeated? Again, we're taking some liberties here. So we're going to go ahead and assume in this situation that Alabama is a one-loss conference champion. So Georgia, they go undefeated. They get to Atlanta, obviously, as they already punched their ticket, and they end up playing Bama. They lose to Bama. Bama's your one-loss conference champ. We're also going to assume, for the sake of keeping this thing kind of neat and tidy, Texas runs the table. Quinn Ewers kind of adds some nitrous back to that operation at Texas. They're a one-loss conference champ out of the Big 12. So Bama's Bama one-loss conference champ out of the SEC. Texas a one-loss conference champ out of the Big 12. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Florida State, currently undefeated. So we have to assume they lose somewhere. I'm going to assume, for the sake of this conversation, they beat Florida, they get to the ACC title game, and they play Louisville. Now, we're going to say Louisville has to obviously win that game if we're having a conversation where it's one-loss conference champs across the board. So Louisville is your one-loss conference champ out of the ACC. And the Big Ten has to have a one-loss conference champion or just a multiple-loss conference champion. So I want to unpack that right now. So if they have this is tricky to jump into. So if they have a one-loss conference champ, that means Michigan or Ohio State lost this upcoming weekend. Ohio State plays Minnesota. Michigan goes to Maryland. So let's say Michigan loses to Maryland. They bounce back the next week, and they beat Ohio State. They go to the Big Ten title game. Here's where we got to take some liberties. If Iowa just goes sicko mode, we're going to assume it's Iowa from the Big Ten West, and they end up beating Michigan or Ohio State in the college or in the Big Ten title game. I think that would eliminate Michigan or Ohio State as being a college football playoff team because they're not a conference champion. I think that's a really big deal to this committee. So, that case, it would allow Louisville to find their way into the college football playoff, or Florida State if they were to drop a game somewhere to Florida and then they beat Louisville and they're in. So ACC, I think in that situation, would get in. Now, if that one-loss Big Ten team, that's Michigan or Ohio State, again, assuming they lose this upcoming weekend and beat the other the next weekend, we're going to say it's Michigan for the sake of this conversation. So Michigan, with one loss, rolls into that Big Ten title game, and they finish as a one-loss conference champion. I think Michigan, based on eye test and resume, would end up getting in over Louisville in that spot. I think also with Florida State, that's another conversation to unpack. But I do think you would probably take Michigan over Florida State in that spot. But that's kind of a can of worms. I don't want to jump too far into that. Let's focus on the one that we had here. Michigan would find their way in. But Louisville, again, if Michigan or Ohio State are not conference champions, you have a multiple-loss Big Ten champ, then I think Louisville would find their way and kick the college football playoff door down. I don't know if we're ready for something like that to happen. It would be just like college football for something like that to happen. Iowa, don't know if y'all heard, don't play much offense, but they play real good defense. So we'll see what happens there. That's kind of how we feel about that. The resume for Louisville, they would have a top 10 win. They would have a top 4 or 5 win against Florida State. They would have a top 20 win over Duke. Just saying. Now, scenario number 2, this individual did not tweet at me, but he put this out there for his following, and I thought it was worth us unpacking together as a community. Scenario number 2 comes from Joel Klatt. And some men, they just want to watch the world burn. And so that's what the scenario is. He says you got the Big Ten champion undefeated. So Ohio State or Michigan, they're undefeated. They're obviously locked in. Then you have Florida State undefeated, which we think will happen. They're obviously locked in. They're set. So those 2 spots are spoken for. He says then you have 2 spots for the following. 1 loss, SEC champ Alabama. 1 loss, Pac-12 champ Oregon. 1 loss, Big 12 champ Texas. And then 2 non-conference champions of Washington and Georgia. Now, to me, right off the bat, we can eliminate those non-conference champions. To me, it's a lot like, hey, you were good enough to be in the class. You were good enough to take the AP portion of this class. But the reality is you don't have the prerequisites. You don't have that class before the AP class to get in. So, sorry, don't make the rules the way that this thing works. Georgia and Washington, in that scenario, I think would get left out. So, how do we go about unpacking this? I'll start with this. I think the committee likes Oregon. By nature of where they're at right now, being at number 6, I think they're really weighing their eye test pretty heavily. I think that win over Utah and the definitive nature in which they did that means a lot. And then also Oregon would avenge their only loss over Washington. So their resume at that point would be a ranked win over Colorado, a definitive ranked win over Colorado, mind you, plus a ranked win over Utah. Again, the committee is freezing these wins. That's why Colorado counts. Oregon State, at that point, could be as high as a top 10 win. It could be somewhere in the top 20 win, depending on what happens this upcoming weekend against Washington. And then you probably have, again, what I just said. You avenge that 1 loss with a top 4 to 5 win over Washington. I think they're in. I think they're in personally. By nature of the way the Pac-12 has played, by the eye test, I think Oregon would be in. Disagree or agree, let me know. But then you look at what we have left. You have Alabama and you have Texas. This is just a nightmare situation for everybody. Again, some men just want to watch the world burn. Alabama probably has the better resume. Let's look at it. If you're freezing wins, which I think the committee is, I'll say it again, I think the committee is freezing wins by nature of Florida State being at 4 last night. Ole Miss is at 15. LSU was at 14. Tennessee is at 17. And oh, by the way, in this scenario, you have a number 1 win over Georgia. Best win in the country. I don't think we're reaching and saying that. Now for Texas, you have a win over number 24 ranked Kansas, number 23 ranked Kansas State. Potentially, if you win the Big 12, you would imagine it's an Oklahoma State team that's somewhere in that top 20 range. So that's 3 ranked wins. And I forgot this one. You have a win over the team you're being compared to, Alabama. Number 3 team in the country when you beat them. So at this point, I think you got to go to the eye test because as of late, Bama has been slaughtering the eye test like they paid someone to take the ACT for them. With flying colors, they've been passing that test. Okay? Now with Texas, I understand they didn't have Quinn Ewers, but 3 of their last 4 games have been decided by 1 score. And they haven't been games where it's just a phenomenal competition on the other side of the sideline. It's been TCU. It's been Houston. Kansas State, I understand, was a ranked team. That's a good win. I don't want to short them for that kind of win. But the eye test for Texas without Quinn Ewers has left something to be desired. And in this last game against TCU, it's left something to be desired. So I think if Alabama beats Georgia and it's somehow definitive, like take me back to that game where Bryce Young was playing for Alabama and they beat Georgia and it was kind of like a leave no doubt situation, I don't know how that would shake out. If the eye test is even, I think you go to head-to-head, and I think you lean Texas. But if Alabama is the team that has a definitive, hey, they're playing the best football right now, they just beat Georgia by 13 in the SEC title game, I don't know how you would leave them out. So I will say this. I think what the committee would do, I think they would look at head-to-head pretty closely unless Alabama just made it a ridiculous final score in Atlanta against Georgia. And I think Texas would be the team that's in. We've seen so far to this point with the committee, they really value head-to-head. That's important to them. They want that to be a differentiating factor, it seems like, to this point with these teams. So what I think would happen is Texas would get in. But I think Alabama would have a very strong case if it goes to the eye test and if they end up finding their way in that way. And again, I just think the committee likes Oregon. But if Alabama beats Georgia, it's kind of an all bets are off scenario, just so we're on the same page. So that's kind of my feel on it when it comes to that scenario. But let me know in the comments section. Let me know on Twitter and Instagram what y'all think of that as well. So one more scenario we got to get to here from our guy Jake. And also let me know, this tweet is still up on my Twitter page. So if you want us to keep doing this segment, by nature of how y'all are responding, you do. I'll retweet this so we can get some more answers from y'all. A lot of good ones so far. Our guy Jake paints this picture for us. You have a one-loss Alabama, SEC champ. You have a one-loss ACC champ in Florida State. So we're assuming there that loss is to Florida. You have a Pac-12 champion with a one-loss Oregon. You have a Big Ten champion with a one-loss Michigan. So their loss would be to Maryland, I'm assuming. And you have a Big 12 champion with a one-loss Texas, with that loss being to Oklahoma. And then you have the non-conference champions. Spoiler alert, I think these teams are out. One loss Georgia, one loss Ohio State, one loss Washington. All good teams, like I just said, good enough to be in the playoff. If any of those teams somehow found their way in, would we be disappointed in the committee saying, hey, what's the criteria here? But we'd also say, okay, well, that's going to be a really good game. All of those teams deserve to still have a chance. However, I think they're out. This is where it gets weird, man. This is where it gets very, very weird. So I think that Oregon is in. Only loss is to Washington, and you avenge that loss. You would have 4 top 20 wins, one of those being a top 4 to 5 win over Washington. We already unpacked Oregon, so I don't want to do that again. I think Oregon's in. Again, by nature of the eye test, by nature of what the committee is telling us to this point, they like Oregon. If Oregon handles business, I think they're in. Then I think for Michigan, the eye test matters with what that loss would look like to Maryland. And you're saying, JD, they have a loss to Maryland? In this scenario, I believe so, because you're telling me they lose a game but still win the Big Ten. I don't think you can lose to Ohio State and then still find yourself into the Big Ten championship game. I don't think that happens. So you lose to Maryland. How does that look? Is that by a field goal? Or is that like a throwback Purdue-Ohio State game where the wheels came off somehow and Maryland just had your number that day and they run it up? I'm going to go ahead and lean towards the former in that scenario. I think that's the right verbiage. I'm going to lean towards that first option of it being close towards Maryland and Michigan. And then you have a top 10 win over Penn State and a top 2 win over Ohio State and a top 15 win. Let's assume it's Iowa. I think the eye test and that resume is good enough to get Michigan into the college football playoff. So at that point, you have the Pac-12 spoken for, they're in. The Big Ten champ, Michigan, they're spoken for, they're in. Again, in my assessment. So back to resumes, man. Scenario season. What do we think here? We got Bama, Texas, and Florida State, all as one-loss conference champions. We're kind of taking some liberties here with where we think these losses happen at. But these would be the resumes in our mind of what these teams would look like. Alabama would have 3 ranked wins, all of them being in the top 20. You'd have a loss to a number 11 Texas, if you're freezing that loss. And your best win is to Georgia. Number 1 in the country, Georgia. So that's 4 ranked wins. All of them in the top 20. Probably a nice little message sent to the committee too. Like, hey, you sure you want to leave us out after we just beat the top dog in the country? I'm just saying. Texas would have 4 ranked wins. Their loss would be to number 12 Oklahoma. Their best win, again, we're freezing it, number 5 LSU. Or excuse me, I said number 5 LSU. I meant number 3 Alabama. I apologize. Number 3 Alabama. Got ahead of myself. Florida State would have the best win, would be number 5 LSU. They would have 3 ranked wins, 2 top 10, if you're assuming Louisville is a top 10 win in the ACC title game, and your loss would be to an unranked Florida. That's where this gets tricky. So again, to reemphasize that, Florida State's best win is top 5 LSU. Texas's best win is number 3 Alabama. Bama's best win is number 1 Georgia. So the best wins lean towards Bama here. But then you say, well, Texas' best win is actually the team with the best win. So how does that shake out? I don't know. It gets weird when we talk about scenarios, but this is where we're at right now in November in the college football landscape. So just to kind of, like, I sat there in the room and looked at this for a minute, and I was like, man, when it comes to resumes, you could probably make a case for any of these teams, right? Like at the end of the day, all 3 of these teams have a very solid case to be in the college football playoff. Just what I said. When it comes to Alabama, if you beat the number 1 team in the country, the weekend before you announce the college football playoff rankings. By nature of how this committee has decided on these rankings to this point, I don't see a formula. I don't see a method to the madness. I see a lot of people getting in the room, having a conversation, and saying, what do we think? And if Bama beats Georgia, what they would think, I would have to imagine, is that Bama is one of the top 4 teams in the country if their one loss is to a really good Texas team that they ran into week 2. Early in the year, I think that matters. If that loss came week 10, maybe a different conversation. But early in the year, finish the year strong, playing great football, beat the number 1 team, I think Bama's in. So then we go to Texas and Florida State. Both Texas and Florida State, quite honestly, to this point in the year have kind of slowed down in their eye test passing. Like Florida State, the way that they started beating LSU was awesome. Texas beating Bama was awesome. And then the last couple of weeks, it's been like, hey, what's going on in Austin? What's going on in Tallahassee? Are we going to make it? And Texas has the excuse of, well, we didn't have our starting quarterback. How much the committee factors that in, I guess we'll see. I worry that Texas will be a victim of their own conference because in the Big 12 title game, I'm assuming they're going to play like a top 15 Oklahoma State. Florida State will play a top 10 Louisville if chalk holds. So what I think could end up sinking Texas is their own conference. What could sink Florida State is the way they haven't been impressive the rest of the way here. And if they have one loss, that one loss is the worst of these 3 to an unranked Florida. So if it's totally even, I think the Texas loss in this scenario is earlier than the Florida State loss. And so I think you would actually lean towards Texas. I think Texas would get in over Florida State. But again, the eye test, I think, would differentiate between those 2 teams. So again, if your head hurts, you're just like us right now. There's a lot to unpack here. This is so awesome that we're talking about this right now, that we're talking about these 4 spots being decided on. So get at me on Twitter. Let me know your thoughts. Y'all have responded to this in elite fashion when it comes to these college football playoff scenarios. Get them in here. We'll talk about it. We'll put it on the screen. We'll break it down. We'll have a good time, and we'll keep the scenario season rolling. So that's where we sit today when it comes to these college football playoff scenarios. Check back in next weekend and have a pretty good feel that after this weekend, we'll have a different big picture Wednesday when playoff scenarios hit again the following week. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.